Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today we're going to take a look at 8 of the biggest album disappointments in metal history, at least in my opinion. You know, examining albums here where maybe the wait was just too long and it did not live up to the hype. Albums that had to follow up masterpieces of predecessors and just could not fill those shoes, or records where bands changed their sound and just led fans to feel really let down by the end result. So, with that said, let's get started. Kicking things off here with Here in the Now Frontier by Queensryche, released in 1997. This album features a more basic, stripped-down musical style than anything the band had released to that date. Many listeners criticized the band's shift to a more mainstream sound, and this album was recorded at the home studio of Pearl Jam's Stone Gossard, and it's almost like Queensryche were trying to say, you know, hey, we're from Seattle too, trying to associate themselves with that Seattle scene, but didn't really work, right? Of course, this was in the midst of grunge and alternative's rise in the 90s that ultimately left Queensryche feeling, you know, swept by the wayside, kind of like an afterthought after Promised Land, and gone were the days of proggy Queensryche, or even the mix of, you know, big hooks and great lyricism on Operation Mindcrime or, you know, Empire. And you know, this album feels absolutely lifeless in my opinion, and it would only go downhill from here, as Chris DeGarmo would depart the band soon after, which was another massive blow to the band's songwriting going forward. Number 7, going to go with 2016's Battles by In Flames, and it's not so much that this album is just a disappointment, it's really this whole era of In Flames that's a disappointment, you know. After the departure of founding guitarist Jesper Stromblad, who left the band in February of 2010, it was all downhill from there, with each record getting progressively worse and more underwhelming, and In Flames had lost themselves by this point, you know, straying so far away from the Megadeth sound that it put them on the map for an alternative metal approach instead, and Battles really feels like their rock bottom in a lot of senses, and the band has never shied away from evolving their sound, but Battles feels like a complete abandonment of the intensity and authenticity that once defined them. You know, it leans heavily into radio-friendly choruses, polished production, and an overly simplistic approach to the songwriting. Anders Frieden's vocals are overly processed, and the lyrics feel generic. You know, the guitar work is watered down to accommodate the pop metal hooks, and, you know, for me, it doesn't push boundaries, you know, like In Flames should. It plays it safe, and for fans who follow the band through their many phases, Battles feels like the ultimate representation of the identity crisis they were going through at the time. Thankfully, they've come out of it and found their groove again with Foregone from 2023, but things were pretty rough for a while there, and like I said before, I think Battles is their rock bottom. Number 6, let's go with Super Collider by Megadeth. This was, you know, a disappointing record for sure, because it felt like a step away from the band's thrash metal roots in favor of a more radio-friendly hard rock sound, especially coming off the heels of 13 and the very strong Endgame record. You know, fans are hoping for a continuation of the aggressive, intricate riffing on display, and also, you know, you kind of listen to this record and think what could have been, considering this lineup was so great, right? You have Mustaine, Total Schiavo, David Ellefson, Chris Broderick, and Sean Drover. Chris Broderick is fantastic, right? I mean, I really love his playing even on this record on lead guitar, so that is probably the only shining moment on this record is Broderick's playing, but in general here, you know, this record delivered a more mid-tempo, straightforward rock, you know, approach that lacked the technical edge, you know, and thrashy intensity that made Megadeth iconic, right? Tracks like the title track and Burn come off as uninspired and overly polished, at least for me, and even Dave Mustaine's lyrics felt less biting and more generic than usual. Flash is a great musicianship on here, for sure, right? Like I said, great lineup here, but in its execution, this album just feels way too safe and, you know, sacrificed the band's signature ferocity in pursuit of a broader mainstream appeal, kind of like history repeating itself once again. It didn't work for Megadeth in the past. You know, think about albums like Risk and Cryptic Writings, and it didn't work here with Super Collider either. Next at number 5, Chinese Democracy by Guns N' Roses from 2008, and when it comes to albums that, you know, just had big, long waits and didn't live up to the hype and, you know, the time the fans had invested in waiting for the record, perhaps no album comes to mind first other than Chinese Democracy, a really unfocused album released in 2008, but had been recorded between 1998 and 2007 with a revolving door of musicians, you know, tracks getting scrapped and re-recorded, demos getting leaked, legal disputes and more, which all stood in the way of this album, you know, finally getting released. And this is one of those records I think feels more like an Axl Rose solo project than a true GNR record. And there's a lot of really diverse ideas on here, which I appreciate. You have industrial rock, new metal, electronic, as well as that, typical GNR hard rock sound. But the album feels very unfocused, which kind of matches the tumultuous atmosphere around GNR at this time. And it's definitely not without some solid tracks on here, like the title track, Better, Catcher in the Rye, which is unironically one of my favorite GNR songs of all time. But considering the band hadn't made an album of new material since Use Your Illusion, and the release date kept getting pushed back for years, and it became one of those expensive albums to record in rock history, I'd say it's absolutely a disappointment, all things considered. Number 4, No Prayer for the Dying by Iron Maiden, my favorite band of all time, but even they are not immune to the occasional stinker here and there, and Maiden's incredible streak of albums, starting with their debut through Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, came to an end with No Prayer in 1990. After the masterpiece that was Seventh Son, Maiden did a complete 180 and decided to return to their roots here, so to speak, with No Prayer for the Dying, focusing on writing shorter, more concise, radio-friendly tracks with a touch of that British humor, but I think we were all wishing it was just a Monty Python bit. It's the first Maiden album with Yannick Ears on guitar, replacing Adrian Smith, and this album really highlights just how crucial Adrian Smith was to the band's songwriting, and still is, right? But in his absence, even though, I think Yannick is a great guitarist, he could not fill the void of Adrian, in the songwriting department, and on top of that, Bruce had pretty much checked out by this point. His live performances, in support of this record and Fear the Dark feel really uninspired. He can deny it all he wants, but, just go ahead and look at some of those live shows from, 1990 through 1993, and you could tell that his heart was just not in it by this point. It's my least favorite Maiden record from the Bruce Dickinson era, and it does have a few enjoyable tracks on here, though, for sure, like Tail Gunner and Holy Smoke, right, Mother Russia, Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter, but, overall, it just feels like a huge dip in quality compared to Seventh Son just 2 years earlier. Top 3 here with Illa Divinum Insanus by Morbid Angel. Fans were hyped for this record when it was announced, first with David Vincent back in the band since his, reunion with the group in 2004, so expectations were high, and understandably so, but instead of the reunion fueling creativity in the style of classics like, Blessed Are the Sick and Altars of Madness, the band decided to give us their version of Saint Anger with Illa Divinum Insanus, and I know I pick on this record a lot, but it's just such a mess of an album, plagued with industrial experimentation that just doesn't work, atrocious lyricism from David Vincent on his Big Return album, disjointed creative ideas, and perhaps most importantly, a massive Pete Sandoval-sized void on this record. Pete was recovering from back surgery at the time and does not play on the album, replaced by Trey Azagthoth, who, does a pretty unremarkable job, I would say, throughout. I feel like a broken record saying this on the channel, but, I typically like it when bands switch up their sound and try something new to really challenge their audience, but sometimes it just doesn't work out, and it's not the fans' fault for rebelling against it. Number 2, let's talk some black metal here with Dissection and RANT Chaos. After the lengthy prison sentence by Jan from Dissection, his sentence built up a lot of hype for the band's third album to an unsustainable level. And I'd say RANT Chaos pales in comparison to the impactfulness of Storm of the Light's Bane, less influenced by traditional black metal. There's hardly any black metal on here. The production is far too polished for a Dissection record, and after 11 years away, I don't think it was the right time for Dissection to reinvent their sound. Musically, it's a fine record, but it's just not Dissection. It doesn't feel like Dissection or anything like those first 2 albums that made them. It's a fine Megadeth record, but it's just not Dissection. Maybe if this were released as a Jan solo project, it would have gotten a better reception at the time, but it just had the impossible task of following up one of the greatest melodic black metal albums ever, released after over a decade away, and just isn't up to par with the band's first 2 albums, and so when I want to listen to Dissection, I go with Storm or Somber Lane every single time. And lastly, we have the most recent album on this list here, and so maybe it's just a fresh wound, that's why it's number 1, but I'm still really bummed out about this record. I'm talking, of course, about Extinction Level Event by Dark Angel, their first studio album since 1991's Time Does Not Heal, so needless to say, this was a pretty big deal in the world of thrash metal, and then we got this record. A very flat, uninspired, paint-by-numbers thrash album with unremarkable guitar work throughout, and really none of these tracks feel memorable after a 34-year wait. Production sounds cheaply made, and Rob Reinhardt sounds awful on lead vocals, to be honest. I was really let down by that. maybe it's unreasonable to compare this record to classics like Time Does Not Heal or Darkness Ascends, but I was at least expecting a competent return album, especially considering, you have so many great thrash bands in the later stages of their careers doing incredible work like Sodom, Overkill, Morbid Saint, Destruction, and Testament, just to name a few. And speaking of Testament, I can't help but listen to this new album and think, Gene Hoglan left Testament for this? I mean, really, it's one of the worst metal albums of 2025, a record I was really looking forward to as well. Just a bummer all the way around, so when it comes to time in December for me to count down the worst albums of the year, expect this to be pretty high up on that list too. So that wraps up this list here, taking a look at 8 of the most disappointing metal albums of all time. You can see my picks right over here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload, and let me know in the comments section below what are your thoughts on my picks. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And what are some of your biggest letdowns in rock and metal? I want to hear from you. Until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.